Hi, I'm Amy Furness, the Rosamond Ivey Special Collections Archivist and Head of Library and Archives at the AGO. Thanks for joining me to take a closer look at the Jack Pollock phone. I want to acknowledge that the land where the Art Gallery of Ontario operates is Michi-Saagiig Anishinaabe territory and is also the territory of the Wendat and the Haudenosaunee. The Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant is an agreement between the Haudenosaunee Confederacy and the Anishinaabe Three Fires Confederacy to peaceably share and care for the resources around the Great Lakes. Toronto is also governed by a treaty between the federal government of Canada and the Mississaugas of the Credit Anishinaabe Nation. Toronto has always been a trading centre for First Nations. So the Jack Pollock phone is the personal archive of artist and art dealer Jack Pollock, and you can see it here on the shelves in the AGO's Library and Archives vault. Actually, there's one more box, but it didn't quite fit into this frame. And in looking at it, I wanted to take an opportunity to talk more about a person's archives, how they come together, and what is the impulse to amass an archive and to make plans for it after your death. In some ways, this is an extension of a talk that I gave in May 2021 about the archives of artists Frances Loring and Florence Weil. So if you're interested in this, please have a look at that one too. I will give a brief introduction to Jack Pollock for those who aren't familiar with his life story. He was born in 1930 and grew up in the Junction neighborhood of Toronto. His early life is not really part of his archive, but it's something I've been able to piece together from his memoir and from obituaries in the archive. Pollock trained as a visual artist, and then he started his first gallery in 1960 in the Gerrard Street Village neighborhood of Toronto. He is remembered for a really original and generous approach to art dealing, inclusive of a wide variety of artists, and for bringing that same kind of originality and intensity and generous approach to everything else that he did, which included teaching and his own art practice and his hospitality. He had a really outsized personality. He's also remembered for bringing the artist Norval Morrisseau's work to Toronto audiences, but that's not my focus today. And, you know, Jack Pollock lived hard, and he persisted through many physical and mental health struggles and left this archive behind. So the archive was the gift of his niece, Barbara Barrett, to the AGO in 2021. And generally speaking, it includes materials such as Pollock's creative writings, his personal correspondence that he collected, a small number of drawings that he did later in life, newspaper clippings about his career, and then a number of photographs of himself and a few of his friends and clients in the art world. So I'm going to scaffold this talk around three vignettes, I guess, three documents or groups of documents that give just a glimpse into this archive, which is hard to represent in the course of a small talk. But the first of these is the photographs that I mentioned of Pollock himself, which in a sense, when you bring them together, kind of are a multifaceted self-portrait, I guess, of himself as a dealer or as an artist. And pretty consistent thread through them is his flair for the dramatic. I want to just sort of zoom in on this one image, which I wish I could credit the photographer, which is, it's not written on the back of the photo. What is written on the back is Jack Pollock, village artist. So I'm assuming this is probably from the early 1960s when he was when he had his first gallery. And the title of the painting, I assume by him in the background, which is Forest Fire. And I love this photo for the intensity of Pollock's gaze here and the lit match that he's holding up to the camera lens. It's pretty great. The next little glimpse here is just a couple of Pollock's notebooks filled with his writings. The one on the left reflects his poetry. It's kind of an interesting dimension of a person who could never be described as naive, that his poetry has this sort of emotional transparency and a sort of innocence to it, a very sort of unvarnished insight into his thoughts and his dreams and his sort of spirit, which is all there in the archive. He did actually self-published a book of his poems, but there's far more of them in the archive. And on the right is just one page of manuscript material related to a book of memoirs that Pollock eventually published in 1989. This memoir is one that he wrote. It's titled Dear M, Letters from a Gentleman of Excess, referring, of course, to himself, that Pollock wrote starting in 1984. He had undergone a really difficult chapter in his life in the early 1980s, went bankrupt, nearly died of heart issues, and spent some time in hospital. And I think really thought that he was dying and decided to move to a house that he owned in France, a place that he really, really loved, as if to die. But he didn't die. He lived for an incredible almost 3 years there. And in the course of that, wrote these letters to M, who is the initial stands for a psychiatrist that he'd seen briefly in Toronto before leaving. So this somehow became a sort of channel for this outpouring of reflections, both about his sort of current life in France at the time, and then memories of his work in Toronto. Interestingly, because he's sort of having a second chance at life, but has had a brush with mortality. He's kind of taking stock of everything in his life, and that does include the archives as well. So he even refers to them in the course of the memoir. He says, here's a quote, "I have begun to sort out the years of photos, clippings, and notes I brought back from Toronto. As you know, I've never been organized, and it shows in the clutter." It's actually not that cluttered. Archivists see lots of clutter, and there is a sort of sense of order that I guess he was able to impart. But it's always interesting to find that sort of self-reflexive quality within somebody's archives. Finally, I just want to give you a glimpse of some of Jack's artwork. He did not really achieve commercial or critical success as an artist. I think he is represented in the collection of the National Gallery, for example, which is something, but never really as much as he would have hoped. Still, he continued to create throughout his life, and these are examples of things that he did in France during that stay in the 1980s. The images on the left are a series, I think, of playing card designs. They're related to a group of drawings and designs that seem to be related to some kind of hospitality venture. They seem to be designs for menus, for napkins, perhaps for table place cards. And these seem to be playing cards, but it's just this lovely inventive diversity of designs, a little bit mysterious, that is contained in his archive altogether there. And then the image on the right is a design for a poster for, I think, the first exhibition of his art that he held after moving to France. This is in 1984. And kind of a moment of rebirth for him. And just, it's a poster design that he really loved. The black designs on it refer to the bars on the windows of the house that he had in France, which he really loved. It's sort of a recurring motif in a lot of his drawings. And kind of a moment of rebirth and joy for Pollock. Just to wrap this up, this wonderful portrait photo, I think, was taken at the table in the dining room of the house in France. Again, very, very dramatic, very characteristic. And I'll give you a few of Pollock's own words from towards the end of his memoir. He says, "My coat of many colors continues to be fed with patches of bright new acquaintances and is often mended by threads of rediscovered friends. It is a strange robe, part hair shirt and part the softness of angel's skin, part the black and leather of my loins and part the wispy and satin padding of my heart." I feel like I need to acknowledge as part of this talk that Pollock had a lot of ambivalence about the Art Gallery of Ontario. He was critical of the AGO's failure to show contemporary Canadian painting, particularly in the 1960s and the 1970s. And so I like to imagine that with the passage of time and the changing institution, that he would be at peace with his archives being here, but he's not here to speak for himself. So I'm acknowledging it. It's a funny thing about being an archivist. There's a one-sided intimacy to it because you get to receive and care for a very intimate record of a person and their legacy, but it's of course very one-sided. Pollock, I never met, he never met me, and of course, like most people, he didn't get to choose his own archivist. We're tremendously different people, but I'm hopeful there as well. I note from his memoir and his writings that Pollock's motto in life was, "We all are all," which he meant as a sort of spirit of inclusion of people of all walks of life. He had room for, he had a generous spirit, I think, in all of his dealings with people, which is something that comes through loud and clear. Jack Pollock died in 1992, not too long after coming back to Toronto. And there's obituaries that are part of the archive, which obviously is something that one doesn't get to do oneself. So, you know, it's your loved ones who collect obituaries and file them after you're gone. It's part of the care that was taken in this case by his niece, Barbara Barrett. And it's also reflects a sort of, or I want to reflect on the generosity and trust that is involved in giving archives over to an institution. So, you know, just in closing, want to express my gratitude for that gift by Barbara Barrett, and my hope that the archives being at AGO will give rise to future work on Jack Pollock and on his legacy. Thanks for joining me today.